Abortion happens every day. Millions of people around the world will have an abortion each year. But the majority of those people will never talk about their abortion experiences. What if millions of people broke their silence and told the truth about their lives and their choices? This is Melissa Madera in Northampton, Massachusetts, and you're listening to the Abortion Diary podcast. These are the stories we share.
So 2 summers ago, in August of 2013, I found myself just a week before I was supposed to start teaching at the university and being a full-time graduate student, found myself pregnant. And I had sort of an inclination that I was pregnant, but I think I was avoiding it in a certain way. So I just felt off. And this was also at the same time that I was moving in with my partner, who I'd only just been with for a handful of months, and we decided to move in together. So I had just moved all of my belongings in like 2 days before I found out I was pregnant. And I actually I will never forget this, I went to Target to get basil to make pesto, and I just decided to get a pregnancy test just to like throw it into the cart. And telling myself that it would be negative. And I took it once and it was positive. And so I took another one and it was positive. I went back and got more. I took countless pregnancy tests that were all positive. And from that point forward, to be honest, for about maybe the next week or so, my memory feels really fuzzy. I remember feeling inside of myself almost like I didn't even have a choice. And I think in retrospect, I was putting a lot of pressure on myself because I knew that I had to start teaching and I knew I had to be a full-time student almost immediately. And I just went into a kind of autopilot, and I didn't even give myself a moment to think about it. I told 2 or 3 of my closest friends here in town, and I obviously told my partner, and pretty much immediately made an appointment with the only abortion clinic in Tuscaloosa, and had it verified, and then went through the process. But that's something that I at least want to foreground the story with, because I really felt like that whole week felt like an out-of-body experience. I mean, I know that I was in control of all of my decisions and what I was doing, but in many ways, I don't feel like I gave myself the agency that I deserved to really consider what I was doing. So I went to the West Alabama Women's Clinic, which is the only women's clinic in all of Tuscaloosa that does abortions. And that was kind of a intense experience, even locating a place here and realizing there was only one place to go. And made an appointment and went in, or didn't, no, they don't make appointments. I went in and was given a number, I sat in a waiting room with my partner at the time, and had a pretty horrible experience. I first remember that I had my pee tested again, and then they took blood. They told me that I was O negative, which I already knew, which means you have to get a special shot after you've been pregnant so that you don't harm a future pregnancy, right? And all of that was really standard and pretty normal, though again, my memory is fuzzy because I was in this strange state. But my actual experience with the doctor in the room is something that I will never forget. I was with my partner again, who knew this person, because you sort of know everybody in Tuscaloosa. It's such a small place. And this doctor lives in the same neighborhood as my ex-partner's previous partner. And so he's like seen this man sort of walking around, walking his dog. When the doctor came in, he didn't address me. He didn't use my name. He didn't look at me in the face. He didn't say anything to me. He immediately inserted the intravaginal probe. And it was not lubricated, and I was obviously not wet because I was certainly not turned on in any way. And it hurt like hell, and I remember screaming, and I've had intravaginal ultrasounds before. So it was especially horrifying. In that moment, I felt like I was in my body. And he moved it around really quickly and then sort of thrust it out, said, the only words he said to me were 5 weeks, and then he walked out of the room. And I was laying there in the stirrups with my boyfriend, who at the time had like a full view of my genitalia. So the whole thing was just humiliating in multiple ways. Walked out, and I was just laying there bawling for, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 minutes. And then he came back in, and then he addressed me and looked at me in the face. And I had, at that point, the sort of ability to talk to him. I remember now that I had been spotting. And I told him that. And I remember the only thing he said to me, aside from 5 weeks, was that it might already be an unstable pregnancy, and that if I wanted to, I could let it naturally miscarry, that there's a possibility that I would have naturally miscarried. But again, I was just in this autopilot mode, like, must get this out of my body, have to teach in a week, have to be okay to teach in a week, have to be fully present with my students and in my classes. And I said, no, I want to have it done. So I remember they ushered me and my ex-partner into a room, and we had to watch some video, and I don't even remember anything on the video. It was sort of geared towards teenagers who didn't know anything about pregnancy or what their options might be. Though I was surprised, being in the Deep South, that there wasn't some sort of like religious aim. I was fully expecting that and sort of bracing myself for that. So that was nice, at least, that I didn't feel like there were any kind of religious overtones of any kind. Watch this video, and then I had to go home, and I wasn't allowed to make a decision for 48 hours. I had to come home, even though I knew that I wanted to have the abortion, and sort of sit around for 2 days. And those 2 days, again, were very much so blocked from my memory. And I should note that sort of the only thing I remember sort of entering my consciousness at the time was that my partner didn't want to have an abortion. And I remember not even letting myself consider that or think about that. His feelings at all were, in many ways, I pushed them out of my spirit, out of my mind, so that I could just sort of move forward and carry on. So I don't know what I did for those 2 days, but I don't remember. And I went back and I decided to have the medical abortion versus the surgical abortion, which in retrospect I regret on many, many levels. But I have, this is something that I would like to openly talk about, which is that I was molested when I was little, from when I was about 6 months until I was about 2 years old. So I have a lot of issues with doctors, or I guess a lot of people do, but with doctors or medical professionals entering my body at all. So the idea that it would be done by somebody else, I wanted to have all of the power and all of the agency and do it myself in the privacy of my own home. But after the way that my medical abortion went, I wish now that I had just sort of gotten it over with and done it surgically, because I think I would have suffered a lot less in the long run. And the tricky thing is that at the time, I didn't exactly have a place to live. I had just moved all of my belongings in to the place where I was living with my partner, but I wasn't allowed to live here yet because the person who we were subletting the place from was here, and I wasn't technically on the lease. So I was sort of couch surfing with friends also at the same time that I found out I was pregnant, and right before I had to start teaching. So my partner and I got a hotel room, and I have had, I don't know, I feel like more friends than not have had abortions in my life. But I'm realizing now that I wasn't really present for those people in the way that I wish I could have been. And I figured that it would be very much like taking the pills, and it would be horrible for a day and then it would be over with. But that was not my story. What ended up happening was I had to go back to the West Alabama Women's Clinic 2 days later. I had to sit in Dr. Payne's office, which was a surreal and scary experience in and of itself. He had these weird dog or pug statues all over this sort of gaudy, elaborately decorated office. And I remember him shoving the horse pill across the table at me in a little Dixie cup. And my partner was still there with me at this time, being supportive and present. And I had to take that pill in his office. And he said, at this point, you can't go back if you take this pill, that it kills what's inside of me, and that it's not until I take the next set of pills that then it flushes it out of my body. So he sent me home with a prescription, or not with a prescription, but with the actual pills, right? So I had to wait a day. So it was then the next day after that, and I didn't feel physically any different at that point. The next day, we got a hotel because we couldn't be in our home. So I was like, on top of being in sort of a new relationship and being displaced, now I'm in some random hotel in Tuscaloosa. And from what the medical personnel and Dr. Payne told me at the clinic, it was going to happen very quickly upon taking the pills. Well, I took the pills and nothing happened. And I put them in the sides of my cheeks, and we were just sitting around in this hotel room waiting for hours and hours and hours. And I felt nothing but just like utter tear in my body. I felt like a shell of myself. I felt completely empty. And nothing happened, and nothing happened. And we waited around, and my partner went and got food, came back, and we ate. We're just actually sitting around in silence doing nothing. We couldn't even bring ourselves to turn on the TV. And then finally he fell asleep because it was late. I don't remember. It must have been 1 in the morning or so. And then I started having some sort of mild cramping, but it didn't feel like anything more than a bad period. And historically, I've had pretty horrible periods since I was little. And I passed, I don't know, a handful of blood clots, but it wasn't anything that much different than having a bad period. And my partner had encouraged me to take one of the pain pills just in case. So I had taken a pain pill and I felt poorly, but I didn't feel that bad. But then it just stopped. It's like I had a kind of, I don't know, a little bit of a heavy period for like 45 minutes, and then everything just stopped. And at that point, it must have been 3 or 4 in the morning. I got in bed. I think I slept for a couple of hours and we woke up. And I told my partner, I'm like, something's wrong. Like the pills didn't work. Like there's no way that that's it. I mean, if I'm pregnant, my periods tend to be 10 or 15 times heavier than that. There's no way that it's gone. So I called the clinic the next day and they said that I would probably have to take more pills. And I was terrified at that point because my body already felt weird. And I said that the pills weren't working right. And they said, you have to take more pills. So I was waiting around. So now 24 hours have passed since I took the first set of pills. And I'm at my friend's house because, again, I'm still displaced from where I'm living. And I was at my friend's house, which is just down the street. And I don't remember where she was, but I was laying in her bed. And then all of a sudden, this is like 24 hours after I've taken the original set of pills and placed them in my cheeks, I started violently cramping. I mean, violently. And I couldn't even make it into her bathroom. Like I was bleeding all over the place. Like it was all over the floor. It was like a murder scene. And went into her bathroom, and at that moment, I believed in myself that it was out of me or it was gone. I had sort of the best way to describe of what it looked like. It looked sort of like just a very large jellyfish that exited me in that moment. And I was really alone. And it's something that is still really hard for me, is to reckon with that moment. My partner was not present for reasons that I don't feel comfortable talking about, but it was a really scary experience. And I thought to myself that at least it was over with, and that now I would just bleed for a couple of days and I could go back to feeling normal. But that's not what happened. I just kept bleeding for days, and then for weeks, and then I was bleeding for months, and I couldn't stop. My cycle was completely screwed up for several months after that, and I ended up having to go to the student health center. And I was seen by I was seen by a nurse practitioner, by a couple of different gynecologists, and finally a gynecologist recommended that I was going to have to start taking medication to make the bleeding stop. And around that time, when I was reaching my limit, it finally did let up. But I think that I was hemorrhaging off and on for over 2 months at that point. So I feel like I lived my abortion really differently than friends who I've talked about who have had them, but most of my friends have had surgical abortions where it was really, really difficult for about 48 hours, and then they bled, for about a week, and then it was physically over. Mine just wouldn't stop, and it was just this constant daily reminder of the choice that I had made, though at the time it didn't really feel like a choice. And I'm still, almost 2 years later, really sort of frustrated by the lack of information that Dr. Payne and the nurses gave me, because after having done a lot of my own research, this is not that uncommon, that medical abortions completely change, your hormonal chemistry and can cause bleeding for a really long time. And as somebody who is naturally a really heavy bleeder on my periods, I think if I had been given all of that information up front, I would have made really different choices. And that those are a handful of months that will sort of live in my own memory, in my own spirit as a kind of tear, maybe, although I hope not for the rest of my life. Still now, 2 years later, when I have my period, those are the images and the memories that I experience in a very visceral way. And I feel like if it hadn't gone on for so long, that I would be experiencing my menstruation and even to a certain extent my ovulation every month in a really different way. And that's frustrating. So that's sort of the physical side of the story of what happened. In terms of the emotional repercussions, I think that um, I'm really, I, I'm still, even now, it's been almost 2 years, really surprised um, at how deeply it has affected me prior to getting pregnant and having the abortion, and having had a number of friends who have had abortions. I've always been, and I still am, very pro choice and have really believed that until you decide what's growing in you is a spirit and a person that you want to bring into this world, that it's sort of up to the woman to define what is even growing in her person. That's what I've always believed in a very deep level. And I am very shocked with my own reaction to my own experience, which is that, if it's not clear already, I have deep regret about not giving myself the time that I really needed to make the decision that was best for me. I know ultimately, in many ways, that it is a good thing that I had an abortion 2 years ago, but it's also a choice that from time to time I really regret. And that's surprising to me because prior to having this experience, I never considered what was inside of me a person until then I had to go through this experience. And I absolutely consider what was inside of me as a presence. I don't know if I would call it a person. And I've since, and that's something I want to talk about, have given it a whole sort of slew of different names and have created a whole book and project out of this experience. But that's surprising. And I wish that that's something that I had considered more, were the emotional and spiritual repercussions of the decision that I was making, which affected me really deeply. I think that the reason why I really wanted to share this story is that I just finished my MFA in creative writing, and I'm moving to New York City to pursue a master's in divinity, which is a choice that in many ways is born out of the abortion experience, which was simultaneously coupled with a relationship that was falling apart for myriad reasons, and also with the death of my grandmother. And I feel really compelled to speak openly and publicly about the different ways in which people suffer. And I often feel that I feel that the reason that that suffering is the way that it is in so many ways because it is not spoken about in any way. Like, people hold so much inside, and I feel like if we could in some way not necessarily broadcast or like publicize our suffering, but live in a place in which people are more free and open to speak about the ways in which they have suffered, and specifically the ways in which that suffering has affected their bodies and spirits, or whatever you believe you're made of, the whole concoction of a human being plus some, that the intensity of that suffering might not necessarily be lessened, but it would feel more like a cultural or collective suffering rather than something that needs to be endured by an individual in private. And I think that my abortion affected me so deeply for a number of reasons, but one, because I had to have it in the deep South. And I always sort of told myself that if I was going to have an abortion, that it wouldn't be a big deal. And that sounds, in retrospect now, sitting here at 31 years old without that baby, who would be now, a year and a half old, it sounds ridiculous to me as my present and current self from where I'm speaking. But in retrospect, what I'm trying to say is that I feel like if I had lived in a place that wasn't the deep South. I lived in Portland, Oregon for 10 years prior to when I moved here, and had been surrounded by that kind of environment, which is a lot more progressive and a lot more liberal, and had a kind of support system even in the medical sphere that I really needed, and had the information that I had access to, that I wouldn't have suffered in the way that I did. But on top of that, I think that there is like a sort of larger and more profound cultural problem here, which is that suffering is not something that we are supposed to talk about. And by giving voice to pain, you relinquish that pain. Or I know that I am, and that's why, or that I have. And I know that that's why, in many ways, I was compelled to work on this project. And how that project was born, that I found myself not until I had ended my relationship with my partner and moved out, which happened roughly 8 months or so after the abortion, maybe 9 months after the abortion. It wasn't really until I was alone and able to sit with my own sadness and my own grief that I recognized just how tremendous it was. And at that point in time, I didn't really feel like I had any other choice but to try to give it a voice. And because I felt like I was living in a place where I was not going to be able to give it a voice inside of the culture of Tuscaloosa, though I don't really know how I would go about doing that aside from potentially volunteering or having conversations with people who are close with me. And because I am a creative writer and an artist and a performance artist, all of that energy became redirected into this project, which resulted in, well, let me go back. It started as, because I felt like I had all of this pent up grief and sadness. It started as I had the desire to turn my sadness and my grief into some kind of ritual to let go. I wanted to let go of that spirit. I felt like in many ways my relationship with my own grief and sadness was dominating my ability to even be a person and also to be an artist. I was trying to work on other projects, and I couldn't give myself to those other projects because this other experience was dominating my thoughts. And so what started as a handful of prayers, poems that I had written to let go of this spirit ended up as an entire book, which is now a full-length manuscript that I'm working on getting published. And what that looked like in the beginning, it was maybe, 5 or 6 pages of prayers that I had written. And I made a number of different cards. I called them the red cards, where I wrote all of the different names that I had given to the spirit, one of which, for example, is "You Little Hybrid Sideways Human Suit of Words," or "My Little White Fox." And I wrote all of these various names onto these white sheets of paper, which I called the red cards. They were written in red ink. And I took them, and my partner came with me, and we found a body of water. And I read out loud all of the various prayers, and placed the cards in the correct order that I thought might relinquish me from my own sadness. But that wasn't enough. That took me maybe a handful of weeks to a month to write, and that was pretty immediately after I moved out of my ex's house and into my own apartment. And then it was really that summer, it was really almost a year later, that I realized I had a lot more work to do. And I think that there was a part of me that felt sort of embarrassed and almost ashamed that I was still grieving something, because so many of my friends had abortions, and I felt like they just sort of a week later picked up and went on with their lives, went back to work. Though, of course, I wasn't inside of their private spaces in their homes. I don't know how they felt, and I've not had a very close friend or a best friend go through an abortion, just a lot of women in my life, sort of peripherally, or acquaintances who seem to be able to talk about it very comfortably and publicly. And I realized that I had really only just begun that work, and that was a year after it had happened. That was for a number of reasons. That when I was living with my ex, there were a number of circumstances that complicated my ability to be able to grieve that death in a way that I needed to. But it wasn't until a year later, when I was alone, that I realized, oh my God, I have all this work to do. And if I don't do this, this is going to entirely change the trajectory of my life, and not for the good. It's changed the trajectory of my life regardless. But if I had chosen to continue to sort of repress that sadness and grief, I think that it would have led me down a very different road, and one that I can't go down. So what resulted was an entire book of these prayers, and working on them was one of the most painful things that I've ever done in my entire life. There was really no sense of joy involved in writing them. I remember feeling pretty manic. I remember feeling that I wasn't even sure necessarily where the language was coming from. I remember feeling that I thought that that spirit, or that who I called the little fox, was giving me the words. And I remember feeling really scared and questioning my relationship with myself, or feeling like I was crazy, which I know a lot of creative writers and artists do anyway, but especially inside of feeling like I was communicating with a spirit that had been connected to me and I was trying to let go of. I started questioning, in many ways, my own sanity, or my own mental health, or my own the stability of my mental health. But I did it. I wrote and 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 I wrote until I knew it was done. And then I knew it was done. And then I thought to myself, I'm done. I'm done grieving now. I'm going to move on. I'm okay. And then no, I wasn't. I then was staring at a manuscript that I was really proud of, and I remember feeling a huge sense of sort of artistic relief, like I could sort of move on with my life and start working on other projects, but I realized I was not done. And I found myself, at age 31 in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, thinking, how is it possible that my life as an artist and all of these different that my life path has led me to a place where I feel like not only have I needed to spend an entire year of my life having sort of the courage to even write this, but now I feel like I need to perform it in order to completely let go. And so I did. The first performance that I did of it was actually in Chicago, at a art gallery associated with the Art Institute of Chicago, and then I performed it at a couple of different private locations on the East Coast. And then I finally had the courage to do it in Tuscaloosa, which was the hardest place to do it because this is my community and it's a very tight-knit community. And then I did it a handful of times all over Tuscaloosa. So I feel like it's really just now, 2 years later, that I can even start to form the words to talk about the process of having an abortion, which I never thought ever through my entire 20s, that entire 10 years, I thought, well, if that were to happen, that's what I would do, because I'm not ready to be a mom. I don't think that I want to have a child. I don't know if I want to have a child even now. And yet I've spent the majority of the last 2 years processing this experience in pretty profound ways. And it's still, when I say it out loud, it still shocks me even now, even today. Inside of my grief process, inside of, especially when I was still living with my partner for those 8 months after the abortion, I spent a lot of time online researching stories, and mostly it started with when I couldn't stop bleeding. I was looking for other women's experiences, trying to find someone else who had had an experience like mine. And I know that I took a lot of comfort and felt a lot of solace in reading stories that were similar to mine. But what actually ended up happening, and this is something that I'm trying to have the bravery and sort of the integrity to talk about more publicly, especially considering that I am very shortly here moving to New York City to study theology and divinity, because I want to be a secular chaplain, which I know doesn't necessarily make any sense. And that's something that I can clarify if need be, that I want to start speaking really openly about my own struggles with mental health, because that's another thing that I think people tend to suffer in private about and very quietly, and it intensifies the level of that suffering, is that I have had, or I've been diagnosed, though I really struggle with Western diagnoses in general, with OCD. And that's manifested itself in various ways throughout my life. And it's just really in the last year that I've been in therapy and diagnosed with OCD. But the reason that I think that I ended up in therapy, for a lot of reasons, is that the abortion and my experience with the abortion sort of wildly exploded my own OCD. And for long periods of time all throughout my teens and in my 20s, I didn't even have any symptoms, though again, I'm struggling with the Western language that we've been given to even talk about mental health or to even say mental health, and sort of using air quotes here is frustrating because I don't think that mental health can ever be separate from body health or spirit health. It's all the same thing. How you are thinking in your brain is how you're thinking in your body. Like we live and feel through our bodies just as much as we live and feel through our brains. It's all the same thing, right? So I'm trying to remember that, but this is the language I've been given by my culture, and so I'm going to use it because people to a certain extent know what OCD is. But the abortion in many ways created a whole set of new symptoms or experiences in me that I hadn't experienced before with my OCD. And I think that again, and I still harbor anger and frustration towards Dr. Payne and the medical staff there, though I would like to say I can only imagine how courageous that man has to be in Tuscaloosa County to even have an abortion clinic where I don't know what percentage of the population believes that it's unethical and should be illegal. I can only imagine that that man in many ways fears for his life or has probably been threatened, numerous times. So I have that respect for him on that level, but I just wish that I had been treated a little bit more like a whole human being, and had been really given all of the medical information so I could have made the best decision for me and my body and for that spirit now departed. So I really feel like if I had been given that information, I probably would have had the surgical abortion and my physical response wouldn't have been so severe. But it was what it was. I had a medical abortion and I hemorrhaged for months, for over 2 months. And inside of that, and inside of seeing that blood and being confronted by blood clots for so long, and also becoming anemic and then having my body and my experience sort of spiral out of my own control, I started seeing myself as a bad person, and that had never been the case. OCD had always manifested itself in not simpler terms, but I guess so, in that I've always been somebody who has enacted various rituals, which has usually been to write or create art or to create various forms of performance to sort of calm my nerves. I've had bad anxiety since I was a little kid. But this was something different altogether, and it took a long time for me to puzzle piece the pieces together, which is that inside of being confronted with that amount of blood and with seeing myself as somebody who made the choice, though at the time I don't feel like I was making a choice. I didn't feel like I was making a choice. I recognized, or I had to reckon with, potential evil that was living inside of me. And I want to clarify that I'm not using evil in a religious way. I know that there are a lot of people who struggle with OCD, and a lot of that stems from their religious upbringings. And while I had my own super complicated religious upbringing, I'm not a religious person at all. Like I said, I'm interested in sort of secular chaplaincy. I have a deep respect for the ways in which religion figures into people's lives and the ways in which it can be a great comfort and also a sort of survival mechanism to get through this world, which is a really difficult world to live in. But I started seeing, what I was saying is that I was identifying some kind of, for the first time, that I was capable of enacting bad in the world or enacting some kind of evil. Though I don't think it's bad or evil to have an abortion, I started seeing myself as having made a choice that I didn't necessarily want to make at the time and felt sort of compelled and forced by outside forces, like the school was starting and I had to start teaching to make that choice. And that spiraled out of control. And I started having a lot of really scary experiences and being fearful that I would do other bad things or that I was somehow harboring some kind of evil person inside of me. And that was the first time I'd experienced that, was a year after. And it was born out of working on this manuscript, writing this manuscript, starting to perform this manuscript. And I had to really step back and look at that. And I do want to say that now, 2 years later, even though the last 2 years have been the most difficult and the most painful in so many ways in my life, and that the abortion was coupled with the loss of my grandmother, who was the most important human being in my life and who in many ways saved my life, because I had a very fraught childhood too, and was coupled with the sort of death of the relationship with a man who I loved very, very deeply. I think that if I hadn't gone through all of this, I wouldn't be in a place now where I want to try to help others speak openly about the ways in which their own suffering manifests. And I'm trying to live that bravery, or have the sort of audacity to name some of those experiences, like seeing myself as an evil person, or being scared that I might enact that in some way upon myself or another person, and then at the same time being told by my therapist that this is a really normal thing for somebody who has OCD to experience, and actually, like, I'm sort of the kindest kind of person there is, and that somebody who really was going to do those things wouldn't have any kind of empathy. And I hear all of that and I know all of that, but I just want to say that I think that an abortion can be really traumatic without having all of the information and support that somebody needs, and unnecessarily so. But if one is experiencing that form of trauma, they're not alone. And that I know inside of the last couple of years I have felt very, very alone. And I just wish that there could be more stories like, I don't know, not like mine. Not that I want other people to suffer, but I want other people to know that this sort of very intense, deep psychic pain that sort of blooms and is and flourishes in unexpected ways is not abnormal, and that you're not alone, because I'm right there and I want to talk about it, and I'm finally feeling ready to talk about it. So that's the gist of the story. There's a lot more, but
Thank you. Because you live in the South, and it was a huge part of that experience, like being in the South, have you felt like you have found community and have been able to talk about your experience here in Tuscaloosa or in your community?
With my best friends. Outside of that, no. Not the book of prayers that I wrote for the departed spirit, but a different book I'm working on, which is a sort of, it's a book of loosely connected essays about various childhood experiences, and one chapter chronicles in detail my experience, not just having the abortion, but also writing the book of prayers, is something that I actually brought into a creative writing workshop. And that's the closest I came to opening up outside of my close circle of best friends here and my ex-partner at the time. And I will say that that did not go well. And so I feel like if I couldn't do it even inside of a program that is very intimate and very connected, and we're very much a support system for each other and a family, I was likely not going to bring that out into the larger community. Though I will say that I have created space for myself. I haven't found a community, but I've created space for myself in choosing to perform the book, which is also a performance piece, and that I have had just sort of outpouring love and support and gratitude inside of that from some of the most unexpected people, some people who are members of the Tuscaloosan community but who aren't in my program. And that feels really good, and that feels like a really positive human experience. So I was able to give that in a certain way, but I didn't find a community here to share this with. No, I had to search it out in my sort of larger cosmic family of my friends all over the country. Yeah.
How did it feel to perform your piece in Tuscaloosa and in your community?
It was hard. It was exhilarating and freeing and so beautiful in Chicago, and when I performed it elsewhere, away from this community, because doing it for a group of strangers is easy. In a certain way. The point of writing that book was twofold. One, to relinquish myself from my own grief and sadness, because I don't feel like I need to feel badly anymore. And two, to relinquish the spirit from what I perceived as my own sort of figurative stronghold over it. I feel like because I couldn't stop grieving and feeling sad about it, that I wasn't allowing that spirit to move on to wherever it needed to go, wherever that may be, I don't know. But the performance of it is the ultimate act of letting go. Writing it is one thing, but I feel like I write to share it. I don't write just for the self. I try to write for others. So the performance of it is sort of the ultimate act of letting go, really letting go.
Have you felt like you've been able to talk about this experience generally?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, this is such a shock to me, the ways in which I have felt ashamed and embarrassed because I am a liberal, intellectual, like educated, smart woman. Like, I'm 31. I mean, and then to feel this way after having an abortion, it's almost, and then it's tricky because then feeling that way makes me feel it even more. I'm like, why am I feeling embarrassed about my own feelings about this? I wasn't allowing myself to live and just experience it. So yeah, absolutely. I'm a super open book. So I mean, my friends here and then a handful of close friends elsewhere, I have shared it openly, very much so. And then, of course, in performing this book of prayers for the community, well, I don't know, 60 to 100 people in the community heard my story, though they heard it in sort of cryptid, coded, poetic language. They heard it, and it's impossible, even if you aren't a writer, to not identify what's happening inside of that piece. And it's a deeply emotional and spiritual performance too. It's hard to not feel that to a certain extent. So I feel very, very much so open to share, but I don't feel like I've had to create that community of listeners or for any kind of reciprocity. I don't feel like that exists here. And it's tricky too, being older, and Tuscaloosa is a college town. So most people here are 18. And the idea of going to some kind of support group with people who are 13, 14 years younger than me wasn't something that was appealing to me. And I felt like that might cause more frustration than anything. So I'm sure there are support groups for, University of Alabama, maybe undergrads, maybe not. But there's certainly not for somebody in their 30s who ends up having a pretty difficult time. So yeah, I mean, I think that if this had happened to me in Portland, it would have been a completely different story. I think I would have gotten, and maybe that's me, I don't know, stereotyping Portland, but I don't know. I lived there for a decade, and I do think if I'd been there, I would have been treated differently, and I would have been given all of the information I needed. And if I had started having some of these difficult experiences, I would have had many places to go to have the kind of support I needed. And here I felt really sequestered to my home space, which at the time was not a place where I felt like I could grieve or experience it. And I think that if I had grieved it and really experienced those emotions right then, it wouldn't have sort of cascaded into 2 years of an experience of trying to move on. So while it's personal to my past relationship and the ways in which that played into me feeling like I couldn't grieve, it's equally about where I am in the South and not having any outlets aside from my close friends.
You just said that in your relationship you felt like you couldn't grieve. Why did you feel that way?
I think that that's complicated. The nature of my relationship with my ex in many ways was predicated on, or we both had very difficult upbringings, and we both had a lot of different sadnesses and unresolved hurt from our past that we brought into our relationship. And I think that there was a part of me that felt very guilty because he wanted to keep the baby, and I sort of forged ahead, and without really considering his feelings. I didn't consider his feelings. I told myself I was considering his feelings, but I didn't allow myself the time to even consider my feelings, so there's no way I really considered his. Forged ahead and did this thing, and then I think that my guilt was sort of doubled up, and then on top of feeling like I had made a decision against his own will, on top of that, I regretted my own decision, and I was trying to grieve that, but I felt like I couldn't grieve that because he wanted to keep it, I chose not to. So how can I then have those complicated feelings afterwards? And also, I think that the ways that we were interacting and responding to each other created its own kind of toxicity, so that I was wrapped up in trying to salvage our relationship rather than trying to work through my own individual and very personal grief over the loss of that spirit. And so that's why I wasn't able to really grieve the loss of that until I left, because I was so actively involved in trying to resolve or resurrect or recreate or re-begin with him. We didn't really even have a chance to be partners because I got pregnant. I found out I was pregnant 2 days after we moved in together. So that's a long and complicated story, but the short of it is that we were grieving our relationship so much that I don't think either one of us had time to grieve over that spirit. Yeah.
Why do you want to share your story?
I want to share my story because I wish I had had access to other stories at the time. And like I said already, I spent a lot of time online, sort of obsessively, looking up symptoms I was having because I was bleeding for so long, and that seemed abnormal based on what Dr. Payne and the doctors were telling me. But then also trying to read about other women's experience at the same time that I was going through it, because I thought that would be very comforting. And I wish that I had had access to stories that were not just online, but also to hear the sound of somebody's voice is so powerful. And I think that it is so much more personal, that it's something that one can really hopefully connect to. And so I want to share this because I just want other people who maybe are having very long and painful and complicated reactions to a decision they made a long time ago that's going on, like that person is not alone. I'm turning 32 in a couple months, and I'm still sort of actively working through my own grief sort of every time I have a period. At the same time that I don't feel badly for what I did, it's something that I question. I mean, I wrote a whole book about it. So I think that, and then I think it's also possible that some women can have an abortion, and it is a week later, they're okay and they feel good about it, and more power to them. I think that that's absolutely wonderful and that's good, but that this experience doesn't mean that anything is wrong either. It's just that you're a different breed. Everybody is. So I'm sharing my story because I hope that others will feel less alone. Yeah.
How do you feel now that you've shared your story?
I feel good. I feel like it's the first step in a series of steps I want to take. Not just necessarily about the abortion. I think that I want to become more articulate and to become better at articulating all different kinds of hurt and all different kinds of suffering that I have endured, with the goal of helping other people do the same thing. I think that storytelling is maybe the most powerful tool that we have. I think that I do think it's the most powerful tool we have. I mean, I've dedicated my whole life to telling stories in different ways. And my goal is to go into secular chaplaincy with the idea I want to work in mental health settings or in prisons. And I want to combine creative writing, teaching, or storytelling with spiritual counseling to help other people tell stories, not just about abortion, though I suspect that's absolutely going to come up, but about the different ways in which we have been hurt. And I think you can reimagine yourself and reconfigure yourself and rebuild yourself and evolve and become whoever you want to be vis-a-vis storytelling. And that there's that, and in doing so, you aren't denying a past truth, but that one person is many people, and that doesn't have to be a scary thing. And I think for a long time, again, because of the ways that my own thinking has been culturally institutionalized, I feel that it is wrong or bad or crazy to feel like you are many people. And I'm not talking like multiple personalities here. I mean that in the course of one person's life, one person can be many different people. I am a completely different person than I was 2 years ago or even 4 years ago. And so by telling your stories, you re-envision yourself and you can become whole again. But it is hard and it is scary to tell a story. So yeah, I mean, I feel good because I love storytelling, and I think that it is sort of some of the most healing medicine that we've got.
Is there anything else you'd like to share?
To other people out there who either have or haven't been diagnosed with what the Western world calls OCD, you're not crazy, and I don't think there is that there is such thing as being crazy. The word crazy is a product of our culture, and whether somebody has told you that you have or don't have some form of mental illness, or whether you have self-diagnosed yourself or you've been given some list of different diagnoses by a doctor or 10 or however many, that is something that I believe, and deeply so, and not as any kind of scapegoat to make myself feel better about my own experiences. That's a product of our culture. And we are all, whether we like it or not, products of our culture. But I also believe that we have the power to, as the verb I just used a minute ago, re-envision ourselves, and that takes a lot of courage and a lot of bravery and a lot of guts. And I'm in that sort of active throes of trying to do that right now. Open up myself, look at the ways in which I have been told who I am by people in my life, or by a counselor, or by a doctor. Look at the ways in which I have narrated my own history, and sort of denied myself my own truths based on what other people have told me about myself. And that I think that abortion and the act of having abortion, or choosing to have an abortion, or the repercussions of an abortion, is sort of like a very ripe moment for a human being to question the self, and to question sort of how their own mind works. And that it is not uncommon to have really scary, violent thoughts about oneself, or about what one is capable after that happens. I know, because I've talked to a couple of other friends who have had abortions and have had sort of similar experiences, but I think it's something that people are very scared to talk about in a public way. It's common also, if a woman gives birth to a child, to have really similar experiences. And just know that you're not alone, that there are plenty of other people out there having those experiences, and that if you can try to have the bravery to talk about them, you're helping just a bit with something that's deeply embedded part of our culture.
This is Melissa, and thanks again for listening. You can continue to listen to our stories online through our website by subscribing on iTunes or SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. And if you rate and review our podcast on iTunes, it helps new listeners find us by boosting our iTunes ranking. And remember, the Abortion Diary needs your support. Help the Abortion Diary continue its work and share our stories by donating, and consider supporting us with a monthly gift. I'll be back next week with a new story. New stories are posted every Tuesday. Until then, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram. Listen for us next week.